Welcome to the podcast of Rogue Valley Christian Church, located in Medford, Oregon. We strive to be a people who gather together to connect the unconnected to Jesus, grow together in full devotion to God, and serve the world with Him.
Good morning, how are you? Good. If you brought a Bible, you can open that to the book of Mark, chapter 15. If you didn't bring one, I would encourage you. There's a Bible underneath the seat in front of you. Somebody asked me the other day if you don't have a Bible, can you take that one with you? Yes, you can. Just drop $103 in the offering. Totally kidding. You can grab those Bibles, and if you don't have one, and we want you to have a Bible. We believe that the Scriptures are imperative to what we do here on Sunday mornings. In fact, they are our guide, if you will, as it relates to understanding the heart of God. So what's interesting is this. I missed the whole call to worship, and it's not because I didn't want to worship, and it's not because I'm not into being reminded that we're going to take a moment to kind of direct our eyes and our ears towards the Lord. I was changing my clothes because Chris here in the front row in between services got baptized. If you were here, you recognize that that's a sweet and a special moment, and it's one that we're all excited about, and we all count it, honestly, Chris, we all count it as a privilege to join with you in that as your friends and family and witnesses as to what you're doing there. And so that's super exciting and it's encouraging, but because I missed what Travis was talking about, I actually need your help. We're going to do church together. Is that okay? What did Travis talk about? Notre Dame football. Okay. Notre Dame beat Stanford. Stanford beat Oregon last week. This is not good for Oregon fans. Sorry. Don't mean to bring that up, but it happened. So he talked about Notre Dame football. Did he talk about students and they're going crazy? And then he talked about David dancing before the ark and celebrating the reality of God's presence, yes? And then did he, because he did this first service, but then did he in what? Yes. Oh, hey, listen, you can't interrupt and tell me to stop talking when I'm not done talking. Then did he, I'm kidding, yes. Did he encourage you to embrace worship in that sense? That with a sense of joy, yes? With a sense of appreciation and gratitude for what God has done, yeah? Good, that's good to know, because I think that's absolutely important for us. I think one of the things, I don't know if you recall this, but about a year ago, it was a Sunday morning. I walked up here, and I think one of the first things that I said on one of those Sunday mornings about a year ago was, hey, you guys, it's okay to smile, right? It's okay to smile. It's okay to come to church and actually have joy. It's okay to come to church and actually be excited. It's okay to actually come into the sanctuary and worship with all of our hearts, singing with all of our might. It's okay to actually smile about the things of God. It's okay to actually come in and be so overwhelmed by gratitude for all that God has done for us. It's okay for that to leak out our skin a little bit. Does that make sense? And what I mean by that is not sweating. I mean it's smiling and just having a countenance that recognizes that God is great in light of all that He has done. Amen? I would encourage you, church, for us, it really, as we look back at what God has done, and we look back and recognize who He is and how He is continuing to reveal Himself to us, it is worth celebrating. Now, I'm not saying that we should just ignore problems and we should forget about struggles, but even in the midst of those, we can have a sense of joy and gratitude and a countenance of smiling because of what He's done for us, because of what God has done. So Travis draws our attention to that this morning by way of a call to worship, to remind us that, hey, we're actually here, and we're actually choosing to be here, right? We're choosing to be here to recognize the glory of God, to embrace the grace of God, to actually celebrate the love of God. That's what we've come to do. And when we do that, I absolutely dare you to try to do that with a frown on your face. Now, some of you are going like this in this moment, right? I can do that. Well, that's on you, because when I think about the grace of God, when I think about the mercy of God, when I think about the love of God, I can't help but to smile because of how that's affected my heart, how that can affect our hearts. But I got to encourage you, and I got to be honest with you. We don't get that exhortation in any sort of cheap way. Like the ability to come together as those who love Jesus and those who are loved by Jesus. We actually recognize and should remember that this is a gift that came at a great cost. Like there's a reason we get to smile and dance and laugh and celebrate the goodness of God in our lives. And the reason is because Jesus laid down his life on our behalf. In the book of Mark itself, he said, listen, remember, I didn't come to be served, but I came to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. Paul will later say in the book of Romans, chapter 6, verse 23, he'll say, the wages of sin is death. Like the wages of sin is death. If we didn't have Jesus, if we didn't have the gospel, if we didn't have all that he has accomplished, we wouldn't have too long-lasting a reason to smile, because the wages of our sin would overwhelm us with the reality that some of us and some part of us is dying because of it, spiritually, practically. Paul says the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. Earlier in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, he said, listen, God has demonstrated his love for us in that while we were yet sinners. In other words, while we were in the very midst and process and engaging of sin, Christ died for us. And Paul says, this is amazing, because rarely will somebody die for a bad person, but like somebody maybe will die for a good person. But God says, I'll send my son, and he will give his life for you, not when you were at your best, but when you were theoretically, spiritually, theologically, as bad off as you could be. You see, sometimes I get this confused and I think, well, of course Jesus would die for me. I'm decent. So Jesus died for those decent parts of me. Like, what is that? Like decent parts? Just so you know, there's a number of problems with that. The first of which is I'm judging my decency on by somebody else's indecency. That's what makes me decent, is I'm just not as bad off as y'all indecent people. So I put my shoulders out just a little bit and I think, of course, Jesus would do this for me, right? The other more important problem with that, other than it causes comparison among one another, which is a death trap, by the way. The other problem is theologically, it's absolutely wrong. God demonstrates his love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He didn't die for us when we were at our best. He died for us while we were at our worst. And in Mark chapter 15, I suggest to you, we will see some of the worst that humanity has to offer. I'll be the first to admit, if it were up to me, with smiling, dancing thoughts in mind, I'd be the first to admit I'd just like to skip to chapter 16. He raises from the dead, and everybody's happy again. But the only way we get through the resurrection, the only way we get through to Mark chapter 16 from Mark chapter 14 is to go through Mark chapter 15. And I want to encourage you, Travis is right. we, of all people, have reason to smile. We have reason to have a song in our heart and a dance in our step, whatever that looks like, because of what Christ has done for us. Remember, the scripture declares, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Whoever would believe in him would not perish, but have everlasting life." God didn't send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. And in Mark chapter 15, we get an unflinching, brutal glimpse of what that was like. So on the one hand, I want you to hold on to that idea that you can sing and you can dance as a gracious and grateful response to God's love. But on the other hand, we have to go through the depth of God's love. And in order to mine the depths of God's love, we have to be mindful of the horrors and the sinfulness of humanity, which I suggest Mark chapter 15 will clarify for us. So just hang on as we go through it, amen? Mark chapter 15, verse 1. "And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council." Jesus, the night before, had been betrayed. We looked at this last week. And he's handed over to essentially the Jewish religious authorities. And what's described in the first part of Mark chapter 15, verse 1, is he's handed over to the Jewish, if you will, Supreme Court, the highest of religious authorities in Judaism. And they make a decision, after kangaroo courts all night long, they make a decision to get rid of him. It says they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. Now here's the interesting thing. It's worth noting why they delivered him to Pilate. You see, the Jewish nation, the way they existed under Roman rule at that point, they didn't have the freedom to execute people on their own. They could want people to be executed, but they had to go through the Roman authorities to do that. So they hand Jesus over to Pilate. And in doing so, according to Luke chapter 23, we're told that they hand Jesus over to Pilate and accuse him of high treason, not blasphemy. I made mention first service that the Romans would not really have cared about religious blasphemy. They didn't really care or bother themselves with religious Judaism. What they cared and bothered themselves with was political Judaism. They wanted to make sure that the Jews stayed in political order so as not to do any uprisings that would cause the Roman authorities from all the way halfway across the world to come in force. So they hand the religious authorities, it's sneaky and it's actually so twisted as to what they do. They hand him over to Pilate and accuse him of high treason on 3 levels. They tell Pilate in Luke 23 that he was guilty of subverting their nation, which means this: they are telling Pilate he's guilty of trying to stir everybody up against you. This would have gotten Pilate's attention. If they would have said, he's guilty of saying he's God, Pilate would have said, I don't care, away, right? So they say, listen, he's guilty of high treason. He's stirring our nation up against you. And furthermore, according to Luke chapter 23, he opposes paying taxes to Caesar. So not only is he stirring up our nation, but he's also robbing money from you. You see what they're doing? Then, if that's not enough, they go one more thing. They say, not only is he stirring up our nation and telling people not to pay taxes to Caesar, but he's also claiming to be a king. What's you going to do about it, Pilate? He's guilty of high treason, which the Romans have to involve themselves in. Now, the reason I bring this up is because from my perspective, it is horrific. It is horrifically inaccurate. Because what we know about Jesus is the very ones, check this irony out. It's so sad. And this is humanity at its worst, by the way. This is humanity while they were yet sinning. Christ is giving his life for them. They're telling Pilate that he's guilty of the things that they were frustrated that he didn't do. Do you guys follow that irony? Have you ever thought it through like this? They bring Jesus to Pilate and they say he's guilty of high treason, which, by the way, is what they wanted their Messiah to do. They wanted their Messiah. The religious leaders, they expected a Messiah who would come and deliver them from from the oppression of the Romans politically. They wanted a Messiah who would come and bring high treason with him. They wanted a Messiah who would come and stir up their nation against Rome, oppose paying taxes to Rome. They wanted a Messiah who would come and be king in place of Rome. But Jesus, his entire ministry, refuses to play the political game. He's only interested in spiritual help towards humanity. Are you with me? And because of that, he will have nothing to do with their political games, and yet they have the audacity before God himself in the flesh to take him before a man-made leader, a human leader, and say he's guilty of trying to usurp your authority, which Jesus was not. They're literally inventing stories and making stuff up so that they can get rid of him. Now, don't forget, all morning long we will have the contrast of the sinfulness of humanity and the willingness of Jesus to embrace the Father's will and plan, just as he said he would when he got up out of the garden after praying 3 times, not my will, but yours be done. They take him before Pilate. Look at what happens. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" The only question that matters to him. And the chief priests accused him. And he answered him, "You have said so." Then the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate asked him again, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now, Pilate was amazed because he had a sneaky suspicion that these Jews were persnickety about their people. He also had a sneaky suspicion that this Jesus character was not guilty of what they said he was guilty of. He would have known beforehand. Are you with me? They kept track of that stuff. He would have known. So he's got this sneaky suspicion that he's not guilty. And what do you do when you're not guilty? Do you guys ever remember getting in trouble in like kindergarten? Right? I didn't eat the paste. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. Right? Did you guys not eat paste? It's delicious. Tastes like water and flour and glue. Right? That human nature is to defend yourself and go, nuh-uh, nuh-uh, nuh-uh. But we're told that Jesus doesn't answer in response. It's also, just so you know, it's an indication that what is happening is exactly what God said would happen. In Isaiah chapter 53, verses 5 through 7, we read this: "He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities." We're going to see those things. "Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace." We're going to see that in a brutal way. "And with his wounds we are healed." Don't forget that. "All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth." You see, when we get the little details that Jesus doesn't respond and Jesus doesn't defend himself, it's not that he was overwhelmed with what was going on. He was actually embracing fully the prophetic plan of God for how the Messiah would make all wrongs right again. Well, continues on in verse 6 of chapter 15. "Now at the feast there used to, he, speaking of Pilate, used to release for them one prisoner for whom they had asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. 'Pilate, release a prisoner.' And he answered them, saying, 'Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?'" Pilate's got a sneaky suspicion that this is all a bunch of hogwash, so he says, "Okay, well, do you want me to release the king of the Jews? This one." And they yell out and they cry out. Look at what happens. "For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests delivered them up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate said to them, 'Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?'" Again, look at what's going on. We have this contrast between the horrors of humanity's sin. They're actually stirring the crowd up, like getting people to purposely oppose God. Just so you know, the Bible makes it very clear that those who do such a thing will be judged harshly. They're getting them to oppose the plans of God, and they're stirring the crowd up and saying, we want you to release a man who is actually guilty of murder, and we want you to crucify, we want you to kill in the most horrific way that man knows how at the time, the man who's actually innocent of all of the charges that we're bringing against him. We want you to take what is right and do what is wrong, and we want you to take what is wrong and we want you to make it right. Does that make sense? It doesn't, but that's exactly what happens. We want you to get rid of, what do you want me to do with the one who you call the King of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him. We're not even going to answer. We're just going to keep calling out to crucify. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Having scourged Jesus, here's the interesting thing. We just read through it, right? Jesus has already been beaten and punched and mocked and ridiculed through the night. Now he's standing before Pilate, innocent of all charges, but the mob and the crowd, the best or the worst that humanity has to offer, continues to yell out and cry out, crucify him, get rid of him, kill him in the worst way possible. And Pilate decides, okay, but first, let me beat him some more. Just so you guys know, scourging is not pretty, and it's horribly painful. See, what the Romans would do at this moment, when it says that Pilate scourged Jesus, right? They would take his hands, and they would tie them together, and they would attach him to a post. Defenseless, vulnerable, bare before humanity. Back exposed, legs exposed. Cannot defend himself. And then a soldier would be charged with beating him, whipping him. And it wasn't any simple, like, Zorro type whip. Historians note that the scourging was done with what was known as a whip that was called a cat of nine tails. Multiple cords of leather, and woven into the cords of leather were pieces of bone, metal, and glass, so as to inflict the most amount of physical pain and damage that one could do. The Romans themselves understood the brutality of this practice and limited it to a certain number of lashes. But historically, we know this. Most people who had to endure or suffer through scourging never actually made it to that number. They died before it happened. It was that brutal. During first service, I mentioned, because it happens to all of us now because of the wonders of technology and modern filmmaking. At this point, most people, if not all people, have seen some sort of rendering of the crucifixion. We've watched movies, The Passion of the Christ. We've seen The Greatest Story Ever Told. We've watched and we've seen these things. And so we have pictures in our minds. I remember when I saw The Passion, there was a moment when he was being whipped when I actually audibly, out loud, couldn't help myself, and I said, just stop. It was that brutal. But most historians will say that it was beyond imagination in its brutality. Now, if I were you, I'd be thinking, geez, Darrin, I thought Travis told me to dance. I thought you just said to celebrate the love of God. Yeah, but we should dance and we should celebrate it accurately, understanding the depths of it, that it is a love like no other that I have ever encountered in all of my life. It was a love that was willing to allow himself to be attached to a pole and endure an unimaginable beating. And we haven't even gotten to the cross yet. What kind of love is this? Pastorally, I would encourage you at this moment, I would say this: That is a question that you should wrestle with personally. What kind of love does God actually have for me? And to what depths and lengths is it willing to go? I suggest it's willing to go beyond where anybody else would be willing to go. They handed him over to be crucified. And in the book of Mark, Mark is an immediate, quick-moving gospel. So Mark doesn't get into the details much. He just says that he was crucified and he died. We'll get there in a moment. But in my study this week, I came across a description of crucifixion that is decades old, not just recent, by Lee Strobel, although I highly recommend, if you've never read the book, The Case for Christ. I don't recommend books very often from here, but if you have an opportunity, you really should read The Case for Christ. Lee Strobel started out as an investigative journalist who did not want to believe that Jesus was who he said he was, because he felt like his wife's faith ruined his life. And so he set out to disprove that Jesus was who he said he was, so his wife would quit nagging him. And instead, he became a believer, and he wrote a series of books from an investigative journalist perspective, interviewing experts as to what that would have been like. Highly recommend reading that. However, there are older references that describe crucifixion. One goes this way. Simon is ordered to place the cross on the ground, and Jesus is quickly thrown backwards with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire feels for the depressions in the front of the wrist, and he drives a heavy square wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly he moves to the other side and repeats the action, being careful not to put the arms too tightly, but to allow some flexion and movement. The cross is then lifted in place at the top of the vertical beam. The left foot is pressed backwards against the right foot, and with feet extended, toes down, a nail is driven through the arch of each, leaving the knees moderately flexed. The victim is now crucified as he slowly sags down with more weight on the nails in the wrist. Excruciating, fiery pain shoots along the fingers and up the arms to explode in the brain. The nails in the wrist are putting pressure on the median nerves as he pushes himself upward to avoid the stretching torment. The victim will place his full weight on the nail through his feet, and again there is a searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of the feet. At this point, another phenomenon occurs. The victim's arms fatigue. Great waves of cramps sweep over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps comes the inability to push himself upward. Air can be drawn into the lungs but cannot be exhaled. The victim will fight to raise himself in order to get even one small breath. Finally, carbon dioxide builds in the lungs and the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subside. Spasmodically, the victim would be able to push himself upward to exhale and bring in the life-giving oxygen. Hours of limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rending cramps, partial asphyxiation, searing pain as tissue is torn from his lacerated back as he moves up and down against the rough timber. The victim would experience even more agony, a deep crushing pain in the chest as the pericardium slowly fills with the serum and begins to compress the heart. It is now almost over. The victim will die ultimately from a broken heart, because the heart within the body will experience so much trauma and torture that it'll explode. Mark says that Pilate delivered Jesus over to be crucified. And though it's uncomfortable and not something we like to talk about on a regular basis, the details thereof, it's important to understand those details. It's important to understand exactly what he went through. But so he hands him over to experience all that. But before that, the soldiers have another idea. Look at verse 16. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple robe, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. After that, they led him out to experience even more brutality. The soldiers drag him in where nobody else can see them. Evidently, one of the soldiers talked about it. And he's mocked in one of the most humiliating ways. Oh, you think you're a king of the Jews? Well, here's your robe. Remember, his back is literally flayed open and bleeding and tender and the source of excruciating pain, and they put fabric on it. They take a crown of thorns and they weave it together and they jam it on his head, all in mocking or in mockery. Then, as if that's not ridiculous enough, they actually take a reed and they begin to beat him with it, and they spit on him and they mock him. Again, I would highly recommend that each one of us ask ourselves, what kind of love is this? The reason I suggest that we ask ourselves that question is because there are a lot of things in our lives that claim to love us. There are a lot of people, there are a lot of hobbies, there are a lot of things that promise lots of love but don't deliver what Jesus has delivered. Even while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Well, they led him out to crucify him, and as you can imagine, he is physically unable to carry his own cross. That was the custom, historically, as the Romans, to add humiliation to their impending doom. Victims, people who were sentenced to crucifixion, had to suffer the humiliation of carrying their own cross through the city and out to the place of crucifixion. In this place, that place called Golgotha. Just so you know, the Romans humiliated them as much as they could, so most likely, and in most circumstances, they had to carry that cross naked, exposed, bleeding, and brutalized. Well, Jesus is unable to do that, so they compel a passerby, verse 21, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry the cross, and they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. They crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. Again, prophetic hints as to what was happening was exactly what God said it would happen. And it was the third hour, about 9 a.m, when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." And those who crucified with him also reviled him. What's shocking about this episode or this narrative and the insights that we get into it, the very ones that he is dying to provide the option or the choice or the ability to be forgiven, are mocking him and challenging him, come down from the cross, misunderstanding that the only way that they could actually have hope for the forgiveness of everything that they're doing was through the cross. It had to be this way, according to the will and the purpose and plans of the Father. But they don't understand it, and they continue to mock him, and they continue to revile him. Verse 33, and at the 6th hour, when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. It's a weird phenomenon. Scholars argue whether it was a cloud or a cosmic sign from heaven, but darkness came upon the land when there was not supposed to be any darkness for 3 hours. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out, or about 3 p.m, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." And some ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to take him down." Even that detail is brutal. The sour wine is to prolong the suffering. It's to make him last a little longer and see if Elijah will really come. He's become a curiosity. He's become a sideshow. He's become like the main player in their little twisted play. And all the while, they miss the reality that you have the Son of God giving his life as a ransom for many. Verse 37. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. He gave up his life. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurions who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. Whatever that was and however that moment worked out, there was one who witnessed it, who had the willingness to somehow attribute it to God and say, I don't know about a lot of things, but I know I have never seen this. You see, a centurion in that time would have seen a number of people been crucified. He would have experienced a number of people dying as a result of crucifixion, and there was something that happened with Jesus that was different than everything else that he had seen, that led him to believe that this man was different than all other men. And the charge that was put over him was that he was the King of the Jews, so there was something significant going on here. In verse 40, it says, there were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they used to follow him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Now remember, these details are in there because Peter is most likely recalling this narrative, telling this crucifixion story, his remembrances of it, to John Mark, who wrote this gospel. And he's giving him historical details that could have been corroborated. They could have been, evidenced. They would have been investigated to see if Peter was telling the truth or not. And he was. Well, from here we know this, he's buried. And when evening came, verse 42, since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, just so you know, the word council there it means the Sanhedrin. Joseph was one of the most important people in Israel at the time, and apparently he believed, apparently he cared about what was going on. It says, he himself was looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died. You see, crucifixion normally took much longer. It was a long, torturous process of trying to fight for air, all the while racing against the reality that your heart will explode at some point. And it usually took an excruciating long time. But Jesus willingly gave up his life long before that. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he had learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph brought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. The book of John, chapter 19, tells us that Nicodemus actually helped Joseph of Arimathea do this. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. And Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. And Mark chapter 15 ends there. What's interesting is this. I'm going to state the obvious. Mark chapter 15 is followed by Mark chapter 16. And Mark chapter 16 is the resurrection. So it's no coincidence that 15 ends with his burial. And we have to understand that his burial narrative is absolutely important. See, there were eyewitnesses that saw Joseph and Nicodemus take the body down, prep it, and put it in a tomb. Two Marys knew exactly where the tomb was. There were eyewitnesses who saw Jesus dead and buried. You see, this is historically super, super important to us. Because some would say, no, he never really died. How do we know? We didn't see it. It never really happened. He didn't raise from the dead. He never really died on the cross. They took him down and they resuscitated him, stitched up his wounds, and he was good, as if it were some sort of weird science fiction type adventure story movie thing. I didn't know what I was going to say right there, so I just made it up. But that's not at all the point. The point is this: it's there because Mark is making it very clear that Peter knew that he had died. And the only way chapter 16 comes is through chapter 15. Without a burial, there is no resurrection. Do you see what I mean? Not only theologically, but practically. If they can argue as to whether he was buried or not, they can argue as to whether he really raised from the dead or not. But it's very clear, according to the scriptures, which, by the way, are the very words handed down from God. And I don't care what anybody else says. To me, that's authoritative. Are you with me? Oh, maybe you're not. The very authoritative words of God communicate that he died, which makes the resurrection all the more miraculous. You do not want to miss next week. I'm telling you right now. It will be a slightly different vibe in here. You don't want to miss next week, because the resurrection really happens. But the only way you get there is through a burial. And the only way you arrive at a burial is because somebody died. And the only way you get to the death of Jesus is through the torture, the torment, the humiliation, through the crucifixion. And as we do this, the weight of God's unbelievable love gets heavier and heavier and heavier for us. See, Mark chapter 15 should elevate the reality of who God is. He is a God who would love the world that much. There's a couple of interesting observations that's worth noting. One, while everyone else around him seemed to be looking out for themselves, Jesus entrusts himself to God in order to look out for everyone else. Pilate, the religious leaders, they're just protecting their own self-interests. And in doing so, Jesus suffers. But the very reality of his suffering was the venue or the vehicle or the way in which they would be looked out for ultimately. Like, it's really important for us to understand that, you guys. Sometimes it's really easy to think that my deal is the only deal and the most important deal. What's happening to me. And I got news for you. If God is a God who can work all things out together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purposes, he's not just a God that makes everything better. He's a God who takes everything and works it out according to his purposes and his plans for this world to get better. And you and me and my deal and even my sense of suffering is not the main point. The main point is what God is accomplishing with it. Does that make sense? Obviously not a popular message to preach these days, but it's still true. Another observation, while everyone else was doing whatever it took to avoid any kind of personal suffering, Jesus willingly submitted himself to a profound amount of unimaginable suffering. Profound in what it accomplished theologically, unimaginable because none of us like to actually read it and talk about it. Everybody else was avoiding suffering at all costs. The religious leaders, everybody else, let's do anything we can to get rid of him so that we don't have to suffer in any way. Jesus himself willingly embracing suffering so that we could all get better in every way, i.e., have all of our sins forgiven. The Bible declares there can be no forgiveness of sin without the shedding of blood. And according to the accounts that we have just looked at, there was a lot of blood shed on your behalf and mine. It's interesting also to note that while everybody who passed by him passed judgment on him, Jesus willingly took upon himself the judgment of God for all of their sins and for what everybody else deserved. You see, here's the deal. This is why one of our elders, in this case named Travis, can come up on a Sunday morning when we're about to read through all of this and say, hey, we gather together and we have this incredible opportunity to rejoice in everything that God has done, to celebrate with our lives everything that God has done, to get a little bit. He even uses a football story. First service, there was a guy here who had been to the University of Oregon, like, is that how you say it? The Duck game the week before, right? And he showed up at church last week and he couldn't talk. You know why he couldn't talk? Because he was at the Duck game yelling and screaming about football. Football! Like, how important is football in the scope of life and liberty and everything? I know it's Sunday, and college football was yesterday, and NFL is today. But I'm telling you, outside of the United States of America, most other countries make fun of our football because we play it with our hands. It's a whole other story. But this guy was at the Duck game, and he was screaming and he was yelling over stuff, and we talked about it. We laughed about how easy it is for us to get wrapped up and get super excited about things that really don't matter that much. I mean, they're fun. How many of you have been to a football game? They're great. It's great. It's a lot of fun. You can yell and scream and dress up and paint your chest. It's fine. But none of that is the reality of everything that Jesus has accomplished for us. Do you know this? We have had the opportunity, I'm going to state the obvious, we have had the opportunity to wake up this morning. Last night, did you guys hear the lightning? Did you guys hear it? How many of you thought, oh no, is God going to get me? Did anybody like duck and hide and go, I knew it, I know he saw it when I did this. I know he was aware of it when I said this or when I thought that. Did any of you go, oh, God's trying to strike me down. Johnny Cash was right. Did anybody do that? No. You know why? Because Jesus has actually paid it all. You know why we don't fear? Because Jesus has actually willingly embraced the cross, and he embraced the suffering, and he shed his blood, and he died so that we could actually live a different life. We don't actually have to worry with the lightning or the thunder. We get to come to church. Did any of you, I've had people tell me, I could never go set foot into your church. I'd probably blow up right there. And they're trying to say that, well, I've lived such a bad life that I could never go to church. And I'm like, no, that's the point, right? Jesus has done everything so that when you walk through those doors, you don't superstitiously combust. Right? Just by the way, which is all within the realm of God's ability. But it doesn't happen. You come in here, we come in, and we're not worried about what's happening behind us or in front of us. We actually have the opportunity to come in here and not fear the judgment of God. We don't have to fear somebody from up front or an angel's presence showing up, angelic presence showing up and saying, you. We don't do that. You know why? Well, probably because we just don't think about it, and your brains don't work like mine, and that's fine. But deep down inside, we don't have to worry on those levels. Why? Because Jesus Christ came and he gave his life as a ransom for you and for me. So now, when Travis says, when we say we should celebrate God's grace, we should absolutely have joy and gratitude over his mercy and actually embrace and live out the reality of his love. We can do that. Why? Because Jesus paid every amount of price necessary for that privilege for you and I, and we walk around thinking, but the Ducks lost. Right? Like, I would hope that today becomes an encouragement to actually live a life that is truly a reflection of a heart that appreciates all that God has done for them. Let's stand for just a moment.